So please join me in giving a big AFS Austin welcome to Ethan Hawke, here to introduce today's film.
All right, so obviously I've continued the jumpsuit theme in this thing because this is to honor Paul. I've the full-on racing jumpsuit to integrate his whole life. First started wearing the jumpsuit during Cool Hand Luke, and then that's part of why I got into racing, because he liked the way he looked in jumpsuits. Okay, so this is the Paul Newman Western series with the alt title, Paul Newman's Personal War with John Wayne. I think after you see this movie, you'll begin to understand more what I'm talking about in regards to this war with John Wayne's America. Okay, but today I have something really special. This screening means a lot to me. In the height of the pandemic, I'm trying to make this documentary about Paul and Joanne, and I'm like in my basement watching by myself the life and times of Judge Roy Bean, and I'm howling with laughter. Nobody would watch the movie with me, and it was like midnight and it ended, and I was like, someday I'm gonna get a group of awesome people together and we're gonna watch this movie together because it deserves to be seen, and this day has arrived. It's John Huston. It's crazy. I wish the Coen Brothers were here because I want to ask them. I think they stole every idea they ever had from this movie. I personally didn't. I saw it when I was a kid with my dad, like, just on TV. We watched it, and I loved it. I remember loving it, but completely forgot about the movie. And when I watched it, I realized that I stole my entire performance from A Good Lord Bird from this movie. I didn't know I did, but I was like, oh, that was in the back of my psyche. I thought I had an original idea, but I didn't. But today, I really want to do this. I beg your patience for 1 second. I promise it won't be long. But when I was doing the documentary, the whole thing that it was, the kids called me up, Newman and Woodward's kids, and asked me if I would do this. And I was like, well, what do you have? And they were like, well, Dad was trying to do a memoir that he abandoned. And what he did is he had his best friend, Stuart Stern, who was a brilliant screenwriter. He wrote Rebel Without a Cause, Rachel, a lot of great movies. He had Stuart go around and interview all of Paul's closest friends and collaborators. And he really interviewed nannies, assistants, Scorsese. I mean, just, everybody he worked with, the kids, his war buddies, blah, 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 everybody. But one of the best interviews was with John Huston. And in the process of making the documentary, you don't get to go down every rabbit hole. I mean, all the rabbit holes didn't make the final cut. I went down them all. And I have here the transcript the kids sent me from Paul's abandoned manuscript of the interview, the original interview with John Huston. I'm going to attempt to do my best John Huston to tell you what John Huston had to say about his friend Paul Newman. Well, I first met Paul on a plane ride to Paris. He sat beside me. He seemed very young, I suppose he was. Remarkably beautiful young man, of course. Though I hesitate to use the word, there was a kind of purity within and without that's maintained very well through the years. I was struck by his eagerness. There was an enormous curiosity about Paris in this case. He'd never been there before. He was from Ohio. I remember his wife sitting apart knitting. I don't know why, but she had that quality too. They had a quality as people that was singular, and it gave me the trust to send them to some friends to make their way a little easier and show them Paris in a way that wasn't ordinary. I sent them with no hesitation at all. I don't know what Paris he showed them, but I was excited to know. All right, that's just a little intro. Okay, so no, I'm not done. You're getting the full thing. Don't clap yet, because this gets good. That's just the intro of the intro. All right. I like the story of Judge Roy Bean because it was American. It told the time of an innocent time. Ha! I talked to Paul about it twice, once at Malibu, once in Connecticut, and very quickly we agreed. He's not a man of words, but he said what was necessary to say, and I did too. And mainly, I remember that we had a very pleasant lunch and some wonderful wine that he was eager to share. But I wasn't there to ask him about character. We both knew who the character was. He's a consummate actor, after all. He knows his job, and I trusted him to do it well. And he took the risk, and he did it. It's an elegant performance. one of his finest. We rehearsed a good deal, sat around the table, read the script. I didn't let him move. I didn't stage anything. I didn't want to set it. Didn't want to tie him down. I wanted it just to happen. Hold on. And Paul arrived at the rehearsal room as Judge Roy Bean. It was complete from the start. I never seen him prepare. The whole characterization I thought was fresh, surprising, spontaneous. Paul would be transformed into the judge. He transformed himself. He transformed in front of the camera. He surprised me right along with the audience. Whenever I get a glimpse of it, as I do from time to time on television, I go on relishing it all the more. I marvel at it. I think it's one of the best performances I have ever seen. Whatever I said to him, whatever he said to me, required no long conversations about how to play the part. We were on the same wavelength. We understood instantly what the other was about. That's true with any fine artist. The conversation was just a code. Deep thoughts. Okay. We discovered at rehearsal how much had to be done with the script, the dialogue, the ending. It all needed work. There was no convincing third act. All Paul's scenes were terribly written. Of course, we tried to straighten them out during the making. We often wrote and put the scene together right there, right at the time, on the spot. It was easier when John Milius wasn't there, actually. John Milius is a fine writer, but the script was not ready but we just had to start, the way it is so often in this business. You have to go as soon as you can before there's a chance for second thoughts, a change of studio guards, and if you got to go whether you're ready or not. We just wrote it right there. I'm not done yet. John Milius, I have great affection for him, but I don't agree with anything John says about most every subject. Still, I like him fine. After shooting, we used to assemble in my trailer at night, just after we wrap, and Paul would always come in and have a drink before he'd drive home. Yeah, I stayed there. There was a man named Neil who had the bear. He was the animal trainer, and he had along with him a very fine lion, a beautiful black-maned lion, and the lion was a wonderful creature. One night, he brought the lion into the trailer, and we all admired and petted the lion, and it liked that, and it stretched out on my floor and presently. Then the next night, this is too good. I have to read it to you. All right, hold on. But okay. Do you mind if I just sit here? Because it's really worth it. I promise. Okay. Then the next night, when the trainer had the lion out, the lion obviously wanted to come back and pay another call. The lion would come in without the trainer. I'd have guests. The guests would be sitting in there with martinis in hand, and a 450-pound black maned lion would enter my trailer. It was marvelous. It was so funny. Time after time, and the reactions of those who were quite unprepared for the advent of the lion. It was marvelous. Paul enjoyed this deeply. The last night. Wait, did I miss that? Hold on, because it's all gold. It's all gold. Okay, the last night when we burned the town down, it was the final night of shooting. I left the set in an ambulance while Paul and the crew serenaded me. It was one of my first real contests with emphysema. I've been coughing, trying as it went on, and then I had pneumonia, and I was sick, and I had to drink to keep even with it. I didn't get drunk. It was just the only way I could keep going all night. And that's last night it suddenly hit me. Yes, it was a bad time. Now listen. Paul, of course, is incomparable. I find no fault in him. No flaw as an actor or as a man. There is no one with more style, more grace, more decency. He's a moral man, an ethical man, superb in every way. I admire so much the way he's lived his life. This is a business where the others of his accomplishment cover themselves with the honey of self-importance, as though they'd just come back from the hive. But never Paul. He's a modest man, a professional man who doesn't dramatize himself at all, and the most charming companion in the world. He'd never dramatize himself the way that one feels others in his league have. Marlon, for example, whom I admire tremendously, does dramatize himself, perhaps quite consciously. Jack Nicholson and Paul live on the same street, but they have different addresses. Paul is incomparable. I subscribe to him in every way. I'd like to have Paul for president, Secretary of State, any public office that is sufficiently important. Paul has a natural grace that would put him at ease on Skid Row or Death Row or the front row in the Vatican. And you know what? he'd put everybody else at ease too. Thank you, John Huston. Okay. Just so it didn't, you understand why it didn't make the final cut. But, you know, so we're about to see a hell of a Western. Sit back, relax. If it's not too early, get a beer and enjoy yourself. Okay, more later with Adam.
So, hell of a movie.
Wow.
It's a lot of movie.
It's fun to watch people have a really good time. You know, it's a strange thing when I watch that movie. There's something, you know, when you watch kids put on a play or people singing or anything, when you watch people seem to really enjoy what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And there's something about the whole spirit of this movie that seems so nuts. I mean, it was funny to watch it, imagining them in the trailer having martinis and with a lion stretching out. You can kind of imagine that's what it was like, right?
Yeah, no, totally. I want to ask really quick too, who's the first, how many of you, this is like the first time you're seeing this film? Oh, wow.
Yes, wow.
Awesome.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
It's nuts, right? I mean, it's full on nuts.
Yeah.
What do you think they're trying to say?
I think there's a lot of things they're trying to say. I think what I really love about this film is I don't think it's trying to, I think it's more about asking questions rather than answering them.
I think absolutely. It's certainly on theme with undermining the Western, you know, what this came out in like 73, right?
72, I think.
72. Yeah. Like, this is completely undermining the Westerns that whole generation grew up watching, saying, like, it just bringing up cavalierly these huge political issues that were a moment in a joking way of reminding everybody, like, how disgusting so much of our past is, and just this cavalier way that they do is funny and thought-provoking. The actor in me is so proud of Paul Newman for doing such an outrageous comic performance at this. You know, I mean, he was ready to be made statues out of, you know, and to watch him spoof himself with nothing tongue-in-cheek about it. I mean, he's all in being Judge Roy Bean, but it's mocking John Wayne in a way. Like, we want to just hang him, you know. I mean, it's outrageous and it's so committed, and I love that he had the guts to do it. So many actors, when they get that kind of pedigree, won't take a risk. I mean, John Huston says that's what he really appreciated about him accepting this part, is to just be totally kooky. You can't really imagine Redford or McQueen doing this. You can't really imagine it. And I think likewise, the movie got terrible reviews, and Newman particularly got terrible reviews. One of my favorite interviews with Paul Newman is, it's strange that he did. Dick Cavett says to him, "Have you read the reviews, Paul?" And he's like, you know, they're really bad. He's saying it right to his face. He's like, "They often say you were completely upstaged by the bear," and Paul, with like out missing a beat, says, "You know, that's how little the critical establishment knows about acting. That if one scene partner is thriving, you must give them the stage." He's like, "I thought it was an act of immense graciousness on my part." And who here thinks Paul Newman was hammered when he punched that bear? I mean, when he takes a full-blown swing at a bear. I mean, you know, I like to see Tom Cruise do that. You know, I mean, that's a stunt right there.
Well, I think that's also something with this film too that I think is like so, both sort of thematically and formally, really experimental to a certain extent. I think with this film, because it's like, I think this film is also unique too, because I think after rewatching it, I'd seen it same thing I think as you as a kid on TV a couple times, and I watched it a little while ago, and I was like, oh, whoa, this is kind of wild. This is not only a John Huston movie, but it's also written by John Milius. So it's like, I think you have that aspect of it where it's sort of both sort of John Huston sort of, I guess you could say kind of exploration, but also sort of like how he sort of indicts sort of masculinity to a certain extent, but also John Milius is sort of doubling down on that at every extent. So it's a very interesting combination, but then also seeing, you know, Paul Newman sort of filtering all of those. And I'm curious what you kind of think about with
My
that.
brain does the same thing, because these are some of the most macho guys you can imagine. And so you're like, do they even get the joke? You're not sure. They must.
Yeah.
You know, there's a certain intelligence to everything John Huston did. Even though, I was joking when I'm making a joke about the Coen Brothers. I said stealing. They clearly are some of the most original minds in movies. But you watch that Bad Bob scene, and it's still outrageous. He's albino, he's shooting a horse, he's eating an onion, drinking steaming thing, and he says the most, unbelievable crass shit flies out of his mouth.
And it's Stacy Keach too.
And it's Stacy Keach, and you're like, does John Milius get? He must get it.
I think so.
Yeah, he must get it. And I know John Huston gets it, and yet they're also all still so enjoying and reaping the rewards of being the macho guys they are. Yeah. And so it's a complicated viewing experience. But I do think they are asking questions of themselves and of the way they've spent their life. This is 5 years after Butch Cassidy. There's a funny moment in the movie when it does the, Marmalade, the stupid music video section of it. And that's Huston and Newman riffing on. Newman hated that Singing in the Rain sequence.
Yeah.
It drove him insane. Like, he loved George Roy, but why are we stopping the movie for this? But he didn't quite get it, and he really didn't get why everybody loved it. And so this was like, let's do it with a bear. Yeah. Let's get a dumber song and do it with a bear.
He just sort of plops out Redford for a bear.
Yeah.
It's still like a woman and Newman, but
it's a total and the seesaw for the bike. Yeah. It's they're having a lot of fun, and it's interesting that they didn't feel the script was working, but the script is so bold. It's the narration of various dead people. And then I died of, what is it, diarrhea down. It's so you can't. If the Coen Brothers did it today, you'd think, oh, how original. It's at certain moments the lower the dead body for the photograph.
Well, I think it's also like kind of to your point of asking like how in on the joke are they, and I kind of think they are, because I think for me,
they have to be. It's too consistent. It's too funny.
And there's two things in particular for me, where there's the scene after Newman gets busted, for sort of telling the sex worker who comes into town, like, well, you're going to be a special ward of the state and stuff, and he gets caught. And then there's this scene afterwards where he's with Maria Elena, kind of that one really beautiful unbroken shot.
It's incredible.
Where and he's just sort of talking about that's to me what the West sort of is this idea of, and I also say this being Native American, I know we always sort of joke internally about the settlers were essentially a combination of three things, where it's one, they were incredibly desperate people who came out because there was no other way for them to survive, and going out to these lands that were, very harsh terrains, with having sort of no point of reference. Or they were insane, or it was a combination of the two to a certain extent. And I think that this film really embodies that to a certain extent, where you see that, and it's something where that scene shows all of that, but it also shows, I think, a beauty to that side of those people, I think, of sort of what they saw, or what their lives were and how they sort of saw that. And then I think the second scene in particular, which I think is, a really touching scene, is the scene of where Maria Elena is dying, and the way that Roy Bean talks to her is very harsh, but it's also, you see the way that Newman plays it is that it's that character does not know how to speak any other way than the way that he does, and it's this way that of him saying, and it's so tragic because he's trying to say something, but he can only say it through how he is and stuff, and what is acceptable of that time in terms of how I think you could say men are expected to talk to women, or there's sort of the whole facade of what sort of this machismo thing is.
I think you're really actually getting on it. You're reminding me, this is I was saying to my son a couple years ago about like, so this old toxic masculinity thing, what do you think about it? And he was like, well, Dad, the only toxic masculinity in my life is you. And I thought to myself, like, wait a second. My parents had a hard time with me for not being toxically masculine enough. Like, I'm an actor. I was like, you think I'm toxic? Like, come on, dude. I'm as close to a female as you can get. You know, I'm really, and you realize how much. I'm just thinking out loud with you here, but how much the world is changing, and the ideas of masculinity. And I think those men who made this movie are wrestling with their own. They understand the stupidity. I mean, you know, looking out at this beautiful landscape and talking about building slaughterhouses as this great thing that they're going to do. You know, the joke is not lost on them. They get it. And the land itself is so beautiful and hypnotizing, and we're all such romantics that you kind of get it. You get it in this weird comic way. But I think those scenes that it's so beautiful to me that this bear took the bullet for him. And he's so upset about it that his only way to talk about it is to be mad at the bear. You know?
Yeah.
But then in the same shot, again, played in one shot, in the same speech, when talked about, well, we're not going to bury that guy. He can't be in the same ground with that bear. And you're like, wait, okay, this is really confusing. And that is, you know, the thing about toxic masculinity or whatever, it doesn't just hurt the people around them, it hurts the individual who's that person is in pain. Yeah. And that's until that person understands it and accepts it and forgives it, will they be able to move on and not create pain around them. And the scene with the bear is kind of mirrored in the scene with it's beautiful. He does ask her to marry him there, and it's obvious how much he loves her, and he still can't. It's impossible for him to do anything but play the character he's created for himself. And I've known so many people trapped in that.
Yeah, and I think it's also like, especially watching it again this time, I kind of was like, I think everybody had that, you know, there's that friend who has that older brother who just has the centerfold up on his wall and he worships the centerfold. I'm like, this is a movie about like, what if the West was settled by that guy?
And it was.
And it was.
And it was. It's like, you know, like we got Farrah Fawcett's great, but, you know, Susan, go to hell.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, Farrah Fawcett's amazing. You know, it's like, all right, I guess.
But I think it's like that. There's something about this film where it really sort of looks at like the humanity of somebody like that, of both sort of like, again, even with the thing of it being like this guy has this completely unrealistic idea of, and, you know, and a very selfish idea of what, like, you know, beauty should be. And he also has this woman that's right in front of him the whole time, and he kind of doesn't appreciate it fully until it's really gone. And I think that there's something, again, that's, I would think that's both kind of Huston as well as Milius sort of knowing what they're doing, and also maybe to some extent kind of telling on themselves. And
they're telling on themselves, and they're not really dead positive they know what they're saying.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, you kind of, the end, it's very beautiful that it ends with Lily Langtry. It's very interesting that she becomes a real person walking in this, you know, with all these posters up around her, and it's all gone. I don't know. Again, I love movies that don't talk at you. We always, when studying a work of art, we always want to provide an answer of what it meant. But really, when it's good, somebody's just presenting themselves naked in front of you, and there is Millie. All the other, there's so much. I mean, they can't help but end the movie with an action sequence where everybody gets shot and the thing lights on fire. They can't heal themselves of that desire. You know, yeah. But it's. I think that there's a great Sam Shepard line about how we become the person we're pretending to be, and you have to be really careful about who you pretend to be, because that you will those. there's postures that you assume will become your posture. The face you present will become your face, even though at first it isn't. And I think all of us who've survived our childhood have seen that. Siblings who, sometimes the most sensitive of a group of kids is the one who ends up being the toughest or the meanest, and if you knew them when they were a little kid, you're the one who cried all the time, and now you're beating everybody up. And I think this movie, I think you just said it, this movie is about the realization that America was founded by guys who worshipped women in a poster on the wall and ignored the ones in their life.
Yeah, and I think it's
which doesn't make it not funny when he goes to tell those women, when he apologizes about calling them whores. That is the strangest scene. And then he appears at the end of the take to kind of pee down his own leg. Did you notice that as it's fading out? You're like, what does that mean?
Well, I think also too the thing is there's an interesting thing in the film of how, again, sort of how macho it starts off, and how the story, because of sort of how kind of episodic to a certain extent it sort of is structured, but how the last two real sequences of that film are centered on women. In particular, I think you have Roy Bean's daughter, who has this very idealized version of him, and sort of worships him, but then also sort of sees him at the end. But then again, too, it's sort of, which I think in a lot of ways is a really interesting thing that I don't know that the film ever totally unpacks, but I think it's more about opening up the questions of, it ends on Lily Langtry, who the whole time is sort of this fantasized object of desire. And it, I don't know if there is an answer to that, but I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I think it's about, why the movie lasts and why the movie's funny is there's some honest self-exploration happening through this comedy. And I think that the Altman movie, we're showing Buffalo Bill next, and it takes this is made in 72, whatever. The Altman movie is made in 76, which was the bicentennial. And it's interesting that the characters that Paul loved to play the most, Slapshot and Buffalo. Slapshot is another one where he's playing an outrageous asshole that, and he's really exploring that masculine archetype of, and undermining and making fun of it. I'm just sorry, I'm answering question sidebar, which is, you could make Slapshot is actually written by a woman. She won the Oscar for Coming Home, and it is a total, it functions as a comedy, but it's really making fun of the masculine ethos and how men can't grow up and have a second act of their lives. And it's interesting in this movie that he just doesn't fit. And then he kind of, John Huston often admits they didn't really know how to end this movie. I mean, I wasn't sure what that scene, you asked me a question, I'm giving you a question right back. The scene where he goes to the concert, but he didn't get a ticket, and he can't function in society, right? And then he gets played by some people with the same kind of ethical meter that he has. Yeah. I wasn't sure what that scene was about. How does that fit into it?
I think it's this film is so much about the fantasies that people want to believe in, that I think, in my opinion, I think this film probably wouldn't have worked if he would have met Lily Langtry, because I think that it's so much about the myth of the John Wayne myth of how this country was settled, and people thinking it's clean and everything like that, and there are these noble people out on the range,
death all around the foundation,
and it's anarchy too. I think that's the another huge part of it, and I think it's a lot of, again too, and I think it gets to even to a political level, the idea of well, what law? Who's making up these laws? And it's who is anybody to be judging anybody on this? Yeah. And
do you have anything to say before we find you guilty?
Yeah, exactly. yeah. Or just he decides he is. You know what I mean? He just picks up a law.
In another situation, somebody else is the law.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's I think that's kind of what it is, but I think to a certain extent, it's also sort of, as much as it's dissecting, I think, how American audiences want to see, or they want to believe about the Western, it's also about Roy Bean's own fantasies to a certain extent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. That's what I think of. He becomes the person, he's just an outlaw himself, and he becomes the judge, and he assumes the role, and he assumes it, and he becomes who was pretending to be, and it's kind of, and there's a deep lie at the heart of it that undermines him eventually.
Totally, yeah.
And that's why he doesn't even know that he has to buy a ticket.
Exactly, yeah.
He can't do it the right way.
Yeah. Or I think even like the idea too at the end of, which, I mean, this isn't a new idea, but it's interesting. I don't know if I've necessarily seen it so much in a film, but the idea that like oil was sort of like the death of the West to a certain extent. And it's interesting to see like, sort of these old drunks like getting back up and, reclaiming the town and driving out the oil salesman. And I don't know. I'm curious what you think too. I mean, how much of the ending do you think is like maybe its own fantasy? Because it's like when they show that town, it's very clearly just those two buildings. Like there's nothing left or anything. And is it Rose Bean's fantasy of, or is it his, or,
I don't know. It makes me think about there's battles fought all over the West over land that very few people live on anymore. I did all this research about the Apache Wars when I was working on a story about Geronimo once, and you find huge loss of life and battles over places. Like if you go drive there and go there now, there's nobody there. There was a copper mine there, and now there is a gas station. Yeah. And the stupidity and folly of all this posturing and murder and killing and for perception of power. I mean, they're definitely mocking all this. And the oil thing is, I think these are smart people making this movie. I mean, it's no coincidence that, the great American novel, Moby Dick, is also about oil. That's the oil that they were killing all those whales about. And we just constantly destroy ourselves over greed and short-sighted greed, whatever we're trying to build. We do this to ourselves over and over and over again, and maybe we're doing it with technology now. Maybe, I don't know. But I do think it's part of the fun of watching old Westerns, because Westerns function as a legend. They work very well in metaphor for some reason. Maybe it's the desert. I don't know. But there's a good Western just vibrates with metaphor. And they communicate something to us about what people were thinking about right at that moment. The bicentennial, it's a very moving scene, and the scene to follow about, Sitting Bull goes through this huge, he puts himself through misery, play acting for these people, for the opportunity to speak to the president. He gets to the president won't even let him talk. It's a really heartbreaking scene, and that is, you don't need to be a genius to feel the metaphor in that. And I do think this, all these movies we're watching, particularly HUD, Judge Roy Bean, and Buffalo Bill, are about lies. The lies we tell ourselves, the lies we tell in our absolute passion to defend the lie that we know we have told. And this uses it to great humor. Altman does something weird and Altman-esque with it. Yeah. I'm not exactly sure how to define it.
Yeah. Well, I think also with that, I think, speaking of Altman, I think, this is 72. So this is kind of, just sort of the kickstart of, what people would call like New Hollywood and things like that. I think it's really interesting in particular because I think Newman doesn't necessarily fall within that sort of quote unquote generation or sort of that movement. But I think, him, along with a number of other artists, which I don't know if any of you guys noticed the logo in the beginning of First Artists. Yeah. It was a company that was founded by Newman, Sidney Poitier, Barbra Streisand, and Steve McQueen, and later on Dustin Hoffman. But I think it's something that is also sort of coinciding with, sort of the the breaking of rules and things like that, sort of the disintegration of the studio system to a certain
They were
extent.
really
and,
trying
yeah.
to buck the system. They were trying to make movies that they thought were going to be artist driven. I mean, in general, actors, we don't make great, producers. We don't excel at making money in that way. And this movie really hurt first artists because it lost a lot of money. But it was interesting to see their profiles. Did you guys notice that? Barbra Streisand, Steve McQueen. It was like they really were trying to do something that had some dignity and integrity to it. They produced Poitier's first directing debuts, and they were trying to make movies like this. They were trying to be punk rock, but unfortunately, punk rock movies don't often make a lot of money. And then you don't have any power if you don't make any money, and then the thing folded.
Yeah. But I think it's also interesting, though, too, because it is him starting to step into both kind of his more producerial type role, but also like some of the stuff. I mean, I know the film he made before this with them was Pocket Money, also with an interesting Austin connection, written by Terrence Malick, directed by Stuart Rosenberg.
Who did Cool Hand Luke, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Longtime collaborator with Newman. And then also The Drowning Pool as well, too. But yeah, I'm curious like how you kind of feel like this film in particular sort of falls within Newman's filmography and, where he's sort of at both as an artist, but also maybe even personally to a certain extent.
This, you can see watching, there's a certain, few of you here know me well and know I've said this before, but there's a thing about, I'm very moved by the Bad Bob scene, actually. I mean, when I was a kid, it scared me, and now I find it really moving because there's this thing about celebrity that it puts you in a glass box, right? And if they're putting you in prison and they want to punish you, they put you in isolation, right? And celebrity is a form of isolation. And Bad Bob looks like Elvis. He looks like Michael Jackson. He looks like it's narcissism. It's an embodiment of narcissism. This old West. I'm gonna shoot. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do this. I'm so powerful. My ego is so powerful, and that it just turns in on itself when you get too isolated. And there's something about this movie after Cool Hand Luke, after Butch and Sundance. Paul Newman was. I mean, celebrity was even, we're talking, the Beatles broke. I mean, the celebrity was kind of new to be hero worshipped all over the world. And when you feel yourself becoming an icon, one of the reasons why I like Newman is this movie is him like tapping with a hammer really hard on that box going, I'm not Paul Newman. I am a human being. And I'm going to be weird. I mean, he's walking around the whole movie like this.
The physicality of him, after being lynched and stuff, it's crazy.
He's talking like this. And it's really strange. If you're not an actor, you don't really know like the pressure that gets put on performers to play into their mythology. They pay you money for a reason. They want you to look a certain way to actors. They want the movie to be a hit. The whole reason why he's doing this is why the movie's not successful, and it's why we're watching it 40, 50, whatever, how many years later it is. I mean, that's why I love him, and that's why I care about him, and I mean, I care about his work, is that he's constantly breaking out of it. He's damning himself over and over again, even more viciously in the next film, and he damns himself again in Slapshot, and you feel in the later part of his career, the final act, Color of Money, Verdict, even, Verdict is tough to watch with your kids now because he's a complicated character in the Verdict. But you feel the actor starting to make peace with who he is. You just start to see Nobody's Fool. He starts to allow himself to play likable characters again. And I find that kind of touching too, and just in a personal way, he's really resisting being Paul Newman in these movies, and I both love that, and I'm happy that later he decided it was okay to be Paul Newman.
It's interesting the stuff you were talking about with celebrity in particular, because I think with this film, do you think maybe he was saying anything about it because it is a guy that's obsessed with this one celebrity, and that's also something that is also defining how that society and that culture is being built to a certain extent?
I really think so. I mean, I think just because he became Paul Newman because he did hero worship it. Like, he wanted that. I mean, that's the thing that's so complicated and human about life, is that, you know, be careful what you wish for, right? You like, he's not a victim that he became Paul Newman. In the documentary, I tried to use all these photographs of the dead bodies and things that they're doing something really interesting with that. And I tried to mirror that with Paul Newman, the person, hated getting his picture taken with people. He hated it, and he would really upset fans and upset people all the time that he wouldn't pose for pictures with people until he was much older. And he felt something of people trying to possess you, and he was like, I just want to be an actor. I don't have to stop my life to get a picture with you. You don't know how it makes me feel. You don't know how it makes my kids feel. It makes me feel like you're trying to own me. It's like, it bothers me a lot. And I tried to intercut in so many interviews, he tried so hard to explain why he didn't like it. And it just makes him seem self-centered and uncaring and like a jerk. But I understand, and it's really complicated. What I tried to do in the doc, and I ended up cutting it, and I'm going to probably leave here saying, why did I say it today? Because it's so. But I took my daughter when she was 13 to Graceland, and we took the train down there, and it was just like a little fun thing to do, and it started really bothering her how much people were asking for our photo. And so she tried to do a little experiment where everybody who asked for my photo, she would ask for theirs. And she was like, and she just wanted a couple little pieces of information because she said she was doing a school report. She wanted to know your name and where you're from and why you wanted my photo, because she was just going to put it in the thing. And about 90% of the people said no. What do you mean? What it doesn't. My name's Susan. Why? Yeah. And then it would also come out that they actually had no idea who I was. You know, it's just somebody else wanted my picture, and you know, and so it was. It somehow, I felt like this little experiment got on how it actually is. There is something weird about it, and there's something they're doing about this movie of the iconography of the photo, and there's all these dead bodies in the background. I just thought it was interesting. But again, I never made sense out of it in the doc, and I didn't make sense out of it today.
I know we kind of talked about it a little bit.
Okay, wrapping up. We're getting the
questions, or do we? Oh, okay, cool.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.
That was really fun to watch that movie with you guys.